You're watching World Talks on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. From the NATO summit at The Hague to EU heads of states meeting in Brussels, it's been a week of power diplomacy for Europe. On top of that, Warsaw has signed off on withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention, which prevents the use of anti-personnel mines, and a new poll shows less than 25% of Poles would enlist for war if the country was invaded. So what is the state of the eastern flank in the face of Russian threats? And where to next? Joining me now in the studio is Cordelia Buchanan Ponczek, Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Good evening.
Hello, Aaron. Thank you for having me here.
Can I start with this week's NATO summit? Was it reassuring or not for Central and Eastern Europe?
Was it reassuring or not for Central and Eastern Europe? I personally found it very reassuring. And to back me there were the comments from Finnish President Alexander Stubb, where he said that this was both returning to NATO's roots in terms of really bringing on multiple countries, as well as really ushering in a new era for NATO, where Europe is really taking, full responsibility for what it's going to look like going forward. And obviously, I can't sit here and talk to you about that without mentioning the 5%. That surge in defense spending is really unprecedented. And I think it must feel good for Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltics, because they have been spending at that level or pushing spending at that level for so long. And now finally here, ironclad is this commitment for other countries to do the same. And I think that that's a really good signal. I would also say that there are a lot of things that came out of the summit in terms of the spending, where that money will be spent on both the infrastructure as well as the military, looking at hybrid threats, that I think Central and Eastern Europe should also feel reassured, because these are things that countries like Poland, the Baltics have been flagging to NATO for quite some time now. And now, again, that's been sort of put into writing and put in the map for the way forward. You mentioned the 5% GDP figure. Can other countries within the NATO alliance, I'm thinking about the likes of Spain or Italy, can they meet that kind of a target? 3.5% core defence and then 1.5% on critical infrastructure. Is that attainable? Because it is a big jump, right? It is a big jump. And to ask about whether Spain can do it, you might want the Spanish finance minister in here and not me. I think certainly it does put politicians in a tight spot in terms of domestic political economy. There have been a couple pieces run over the past months as discussions about defense spending have ramped up to say that, countries like Finland or Sweden, for example, might have to borrow or, take money away from their welfare programs, or that one of the reasons that countries have been able to put so much money into welfare has been because they have not put so much money into defense. I think that there are many tools that governments and countries have at their disposal to move money around and to consider how they will meet that 5% threshold. Also, I think that we should mention that this is over 10 years. So this isn't going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen the next year. We have 2035 as the threshold for that. And so that gives countries some time to test out and see which ways they might go. Also, one of the things that you mentioned that I want to touch on is the separation of the 3.5 on the military capability versus the 1.5 on sort of infrastructure, cybersecurity. I think that there are places that countries could sort of creatively find programs that would go towards that 1.5 that does offer some opportunities for how they would distribute that spending. Do you feel like Ukraine was somewhat sidelined in this summit? There was a lot of talk about pleasing President Trump, and there has been some commentary that Ukraine, given it was at the informal dinner but not at the main event, that it was a little bit on the sidelines. And in that light, that Kyiv, despite Mark Rutte saying, look, an irreversible accession path to NATO is still on track, that Kyiv might be a bit worried about that. Do they have cause to be concerned? It's interesting that you should say that. I think last year's summit really put Ukraine front and center, and there was less of that this year. Now, on the other hand, I think that there were some reassurances given to Ukraine from President Trump, where he talked really about this sort of unequivocal support, and that came through really strongly. You also had Zelensky using this commentary from Trump, some of these other concerns or some discussions about military spending, discussions about sort of fortifying the eastern flank and really pushing then for some of the dividends for Ukraine down the road. So while it was very different to last year's summit, I do think that Zelensky and Ukraine were in a good position vis-a-vis the Americans and then vis-a-vis the European support that they received at this year's summit at The Hague.
Eastern flank, you mentioned that they should be reassured after this summit. We've seen satellite imagery of Russia banking up military infrastructure on the Finnish border. I mean, are these signs that Vladimir Putin doesn't just want to stop at Ukraine, and that peace in Ukraine and finding a ceasefire in Ukraine, a permanent ceasefire, is so crucial not just for Ukraine but for the entire Eastern flank?
I think that Europe and the Eastern flank has certainly seen what's happening in Ukraine as tied to their security as well. But I think that states along the Eastern flank, like Poland, like the Baltics, are taking active steps to prepare for any sort of future. Really good example of that in Poland is, of course, the Eastern Shield. Then you have what the Baltics are doing along the defense line, essentially putting, I mean, not just defense, but putting in these real roadblocks to show that NATO is defended up to the very last meter, and really putting these things in place to ensure that the Russians are going to be slowed down or stopped for any incursion into the eastern flank. And I think we could see how important that is for Poland, for the Baltics, but then of course for countries for Finland as well, because this is an entire area that would be impacted by any sort of Russian aggression.
Poland has withdrawn from the Ottawa Convention, or the Parliament has signed off on that, along with Finland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. Now, there's been concerns from the UN and NGOs over this, but the Polish Defence Minister this week saying, quote, "Poland cannot put itself in a straitjacket that would prevent us from defending our homeland." To your point, looking at Ukraine and learning those lessons and thinking we need to prepare ourselves. What do you make of this decision? And you mentioned the Baltic defensive line. Could mines be deployed along that line? Is that the idea?
So it's an interesting distinction actually between the Baltic defense line and between Poland's Eastern Shield, because actually Poland has made it very clear in discussions about their Eastern Shield that they would be prepared to mine that territory already. Now, the Baltic defense line has mines on hold, but they have made it very clear that they will not mine during peacetime, and that those mines are only there as a resort should things, begin to sort of tumble in that direction. I think mining conversations are very difficult conversations to have. I mean, certainly when I speak with Ukrainian colleagues, they're talking about the immense toll that mining is taking in Ukraine, and what sort of effort it will be to demine areas even after sort of the military conflict has boiled down. Having conversations with colleagues about demining in the Black Sea, for example, where they are still demining things from over 50 years ago. So mining should not be taken lightly, but it is something clearly that countries want to have in their arsenal as they look to that eastern neighbour.
So you can understand the concern that, for example, the UN has had. And equally, can you understand that Poland, in a way, is looking at the situation and going, we need to do something here? Because it feels like a very fine balancing act. It
is a very fine balancing act. And I think especially with mining, precisely because it cannot be taken so lightly, thinking of the second and third order effects of mining, during peacetime, certainly during a conflict period, but then after a conflict period comes to a conclusion, the prospect of demining an area and making it ready and livable again is something that leaders need to keep in mind when they consider the mining option.
Baltic Sentry, this patrolling mission in the Baltic Sea, this was launched earlier in the year in the face of these alleged sabotage attempts, these Russian hybrid threats. Do you sense that deterrence has worked against the Kremlin?
I think it's been incredibly important as deterrence and also as signalling. I mean, surveillance is clearly very important. We have the Australians talking about putting a aerial surveillance in Poland, for example, with their plane. So for Baltic Sentry, I think that's really a twofold issue. It's the idea that if something should happen, they are ready to respond right away. And it's the idea that they can anticipate whether something will happen because they have that aerial support, so they can see what's going on. So certainly, I think it has had a very strong role, but it's only one piece in what is a very complicated puzzle of ensuring freedom of navigation in the Baltic Sea, while also ensuring that no more sabotage happens to those ships that are going through those waters.
It's interesting you point that out, because I was in Helsinki when they announced it, and I asked Chancellor Olaf Scholz, or then Chancellor of Germany Olaf Scholz, exactly the question: could at some point the Baltic Sea be closed if these sabotage attempts continue? And he said, no, we want to do everything, of course, possible that it stays open and those routes stay free flowing. Again, how difficult is that challenge to patrol, to try and make sure that you're across some of these threats, but equally to ensure that normal order is resuming?
It's very difficult to patrol. I fly between Warsaw and Helsinki a lot. I can assure you that the Baltic Sea is massive. You probably saw that on your flight to Helsinki as well. So patrolling is difficult. There are new things that are coming online. I mean, Tusk, for example, last year proposed the sort of joint naval policing. We can see also NATO taking it very seriously in terms of their task force that's focused on the Baltic Sea. Obviously, Baltic Sentry is another example. This sort of coordination and intelligence sharing among the Nordic Baltic 8 countries. This is very important. So we see these opportunities to help with the deterrence aspect. But I want to come back to your point on sort of closing the Baltic Sea, because ultimately what is at stake here is the freedom of navigation. And it's not easy, nor is it necessarily legal, to close the Baltic Sea to shipping. And I think that this is something that a lot of lawmakers and politicians find themselves up against, which is why the deterrence and rapid response element is so essential, because it ensures that we can keep the waters open, but it also shows that the Nordic Baltic 8 are going to take anything very seriously and be able to respond to it immediately.
NATO played a role in the Baltic Sentry in that announcement. Mark Rutte was there in Helsinki in January. Do you sense that NATO, as it stands, is fit for purpose in 2025? Or do you feel like it's adapting and trying to find its place, find its identity in this new era of not just a war in Ukraine, for example, but also hybrid threats?
Yeah, I think that NATO, if it is not fit for purpose, it is working to be fit for purpose, which then makes it fit for purpose because it has the ability to adapt and to respond to the feedback that it's getting from its member countries, from those politicians, from the evolution of threats. I mean, certainly there are areas that it needs to step up, but I can see places where it is establishing new task forces or new missions or looking to cooperate in new ways that are responding to those threats. Of course, in places where the EU, where NATO might be falling a bit short, the EU can also pick up the slack. I think that this is an important tool that the Nordic Baltic 8 have in their toolbox and that they can respond to. And then, of course, dialogue between NATO and the European Union is also important in kind of confronting these hybrid threats.
And lastly, a poll shows 23% of Poles would enlist if the country was invaded. Compare that to 45% in Latvia, 82% in Finland. It shapes up as quite low. Of course, we actually had a presentation in our main edition last night, which talked about how the population numbers are very different in those countries. But nevertheless, why do you think that is? How do you think that shakes down?
This is a great question. I don't know if I'll be able to answer it in the amount of time that we have today. I think that one of the things that Finland has really tried to emphasize is a whole of society approach to defense. And that is partly boiled into the way that they do military service and training, for example. It's the way that they do public outreach to ensure that citizens are informed. And it's the way that Finnish citizens understand the threat. But it's also boiled into issues such as transparency and good governance and general high levels of trust in society. And I think that some of the conversations that I've had with Polish colleagues over the past months has shown that Poles want to move in that direction. So I think that that really takes a sort of a communication between, from one side, the top down, from the government to the people, but then on the other side, from the bottom up, from the people to the government, of ensuring the sort of collaboration in, again, this whole of society approach to any sort of threat that may come Poland's way.
Cordelia Buchanan Ponczek, thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks. Do stay with us here on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Goodbye for now.